The biggest scene that I remember from the day was Kabul was a very noisy city, full of people. The traffic was so bad. When the rumors started that the Taliban have reached the belt of Kabul, Kabul kind of jammed, the traffic jammed. Nobody were able to move. So everybody left their cars on the streets and just start running.
It's the 15th of August 2021, and Afghanistan is falling to the Taliban once again.
The Taliban has started entering the capital Kabul from all sides. The Afghan president is currently holding emergency talks with US diplomats as well as top NATO officials.
All around the capital, Kabul, people have begun fleeing their homes. 2 decades after being removed from power by a US-led coalition, the Taliban's flag is flying from shops, homes, car windows. There are young men on motorcycles shooting from Kalashnikovs. Jubilant sounds marking their return. Watching events unfold from his home in Canada was Sanjar Sohail, a veteran Afghan journalist and publisher who had, only weeks before, returned to Afghanistan and seen provinces falling to the Taliban one by one.
I was so shocked and so in a very different state of mind, to be honest, like not believing my eyes that this is actually happening. Because I was also watching the live feed by Al Jazeera, and I saw the Taliban storm the palace and start removing the national flag of Afghanistan and putting their own flag. And I saw the commander of the Taliban that sat on the chair of President Ghani.
New video showing the Taliban inside the Afghan presidential palace there in Kabul. You can see here a number of armed men celebrating and even sitting in the chair that Afghan President Ghani relinquished just hours ago.
President Ashraf Ghani had fled the country for Uzbekistan, saying that he wanted to avoid bloodshed. He left in its wake a vacuum of power filled within hours by Taliban militias.
I was knowing that this is coming, but I wasn't expecting that the span of this collapse would be that big. Because the entire system that were built in the past 20 years with money, with resources, with professionals, and with treasure, with blood, everything just gone. Like in one blink, the entire system collapsed. I was not believing. It was so surreal for me. But it happened. It happened.
I'm Nicola Kelly, and this is Silenced. Today, Afghanistan. What has become of all those who were left behind? And how is one media outlet ensuring that we don't forget them? For Sanjar, witnessing the takeover was an unsettling sight. Though he was safe in Canada, he was responsible for a network of reporters across Afghanistan.
So I started working on evacuating my journalists. In the first few days, I evacuated with the support of some friends 7 female journalists to Albania. And then slowly, some other colleagues were able to leave Afghanistan. And now some of them are hiding, some of them are, in the neighboring countries waiting to come to the West. But a large group of my journalists are still in Afghanistan, working.
Sanjar had set up his media outlet 15 years earlier. Hasht-e-Subh had gained notoriety for its investigative reporting, pioneering a new type of journalism previously unfamiliar to Afghans. Its reporters were known for their tenacity, digging up stories that those in power wanted to bury. Now that the Taliban had returned, the lives of all Sanjar's journalists were at immediate risk.
This network is all over Afghanistan, and they don't know each other. the good thing is, because only me and a few other people in my organization know the real identities of the journalists working in Afghanistan for us. And this is because of their safety and security. We believe if one journalist is captured and they know that the entire network, that could be dangerous for all of them. Now, as a journalist, if you're captured by the Taliban, you're done. Even if you are known by your family members, for the sake of their own safety, they will ask you or force you to stop working as a journalist. So journalism is in a different level of danger in Afghanistan. But at the same time, I think these people, my colleagues, other journalists who are working with other exiled media outlets of Afghanistan, or even those still working openly inside Afghanistan, they are the bravest people of this world. Because despite all of these problems and restrictions and dangers for their safety, for their life, they're still working. And I think this must be appreciated. This must be recognized. And also, I think it's very important to follow the situation inside Afghanistan to see what's happening.
But even as the Taliban gripped power and carried out a series of revenge killings against those it considered infidels, Hasht-e-Subh journalists continued to document, to gather evidence, to let those outside Afghanistan know what was really going on inside their country.
We were able, for example, in the first 6 months of the Taliban takeover, from August 15 to January 15, we documented 500 cases of revenge killing, torture, forced disappearance, and shootings of the former Afghanistan National Security Forces. It was important for me, for my country, and for the entire world to know what's happening inside Afghanistan.
Just talk me through that piece. I think it was for the New York Times, wasn't it? What was the process in actually getting the information about those near 500 killings? How did you go about working with the network of reporters that you've got across Afghanistan? For those who are still inside Afghanistan, that must carry quite a high level of risk. Yeah.
So I'm telling my colleagues that we have to be very careful in not giving any sign to the Taliban or to anyone even in the family that you're working as a journalist. So these people, some of them are real journalists, but some of these people are teachers, shopkeepers, taxi drivers. But they know how to look, how to watch, how to listen, and how to record the things that's happening. We also have a large network of citizen journalists that they are sending us content. So for the New York Times piece, as you mentioned, we start recording the number of casualties in each provinces, in each district, because those days after the Taliban takeover, number of bodies were appearing on the streets, for example, on the highways, in the mountains, and even sometimes the Taliban soldiers and commanders arresting people, torturing people, killing them, even in some cases shooting them in front of their families. And there were public execution of people in the markets. So we start recording all this. And also, I was in contact with some of these former commanders and generals of the army and police. And they were also sending me hints, follow this, follow that. So in just 3 months, we were able to collect thousands of cases. But at the time, my newspaper was not in a good state of operation because my colleagues were on the way going out of Afghanistan, hiding. So I talked to the New York Times and said, this is happening. They accepted, and then we start verifying the cases.
Within a few weeks, they had documented over 500 cases of torture, disappearances, and killings.
So finally, the piece were ready to go for publication. But there were one big problem, and it was my family. Two of my brothers and my mom and my dad was in Afghanistan. And my brother were already interrogated by the Taliban 3 times about me and about Hasht-e-Subh. So I told my family, my brothers and my parents, to leave Afghanistan. So they left Afghanistan by land or by plane. And then I told the New York Times, now you can publish the piece.
But it wasn't just the revenge killings. Afghans were to experience a rollback of rights dating back decades. Schools closed, preventing young girls from gaining an education. Public punishments returned, stonings, executions. Women were, once again, forced back indoors.
People are not allowed to go to school just because they are female, just because of their gender. They are not allowed to go to university. They are not allowed to go to work. Even they are not allowed to go out of their houses without a male companion. And even nowadays, with the new law, the supreme leader of Taliban signed it very recently. It's a vice and virtue law. The sound of women have become a sin. If a man listens to a woman's voice, it's a sin. So now, based on that law, I'm actually doing a sin right now, talking to you. And it's punishable for 3 months of prison.
For a journalist attempting to bear witness and expose the truth about what was going on inside the country, operating under the Taliban became an extreme challenge.
Taliban do not believe in freedom of expression. They do not believe in plural society. They do not believe in freedom of information. Since their takeover, they've been restricting media, journalists, freedom of expression, freedom of flow of information. We have cases, unfortunately, that the Taliban officials are going from one newsroom to another newsroom, censoring content of media. And they've been killing, torturing, arresting, intimidating journalists by large numbers. Afghanistan has dropped from the freedom of expression index by the Reporters Without Borders. It's now at the bottom. Before the Taliban, Afghanistan was like an example for the entire region. I mean, the laws, regulation, and judicial system for the freedom of information and for the protection of freedom of expression was amazing. There was no other examples in the region. But now, Afghanistan is at the bottom, very much close to North Korea. So, yes, those journalists or those media outlets that are fighting for freedom of information, for access to information, for the freedom of media, it's not possible with the Taliban. No, they don't want that. And it's because they want one narrative to control the entire society. They only want a country with one voice, one picture, and one narrative. And that narrative is Talibanization.
You started Hasht-e-Subh at a very different time to the one that you're describing. Can you take us back to that period and just describe what the media landscape was like and what it was like to set up this network of journalists across the country?
Well, since 2003, I started working in media, and I worked in different media outlets before establishing and starting Hasht-e-Subh. But through all those years, I learned that something is missing in the Afghan media sector. Something big was missing, and it was investigative journalism. Investigative journalism were missing in Afghanistan. So, with this idea, I, with a group of friends, talked and started the newspaper.
It wasn't straightforward. Sanjar and his team faced problems with funding, resources, and identifying reliable reporters.
So we printed the first edition of Hasht-e-Subh on May 21, 2007. And we started training people who were interested to work with the Hasht-e-Subh, not only in Kabul, but also I and my colleagues were traveling from one province to another province, providing training for the people who were interested in journalism. And so these people slowly became the network of our investigative reporting. And also slowly, they became like very famous investigative reporters of Afghanistan.
But over the months and years that followed, the network grew, establishing itself as a powerful force relied upon by hundreds of thousands of people in Afghanistan and diaspora communities across the globe.
So we decided in Hasht-e-Subh to be totally impartial in terms of politics. We said that we are not going to support any political party, any political agenda. We also set a red line that we are not receiving funding or advertisement or anything from government. So these actually, paved the way for Hasht-e-Subh to become famous. Famous for being objective, investigative, and impartial.
It must be almost unimaginable now to think about doing any investigations into what the Taliban are doing.
Well, actually, we are still doing investigative reporting despite all of these challenges.
Wow.
So, for example, in the past 6 months, we produced 4 investigative reports about the situation of women in Taliban's custody. So, we cover 30 provinces of Afghanistan out of 34. And we talked to the prisoners, women prisoners. We talked to nurses in the local hospitals or clinics. We talked to families of these prisoners. And we documented very harsh cases of abuse, torture, rape, and even forced abortion. And this is something unique in its nature, that despite all this restriction and control, my colleagues were able to go and collect this data, verify this data.
How? How do you get access to hospitals? Because presumably the Taliban are guarding the hospitals. They're everywhere, right? It must be really difficult to bypass them.
They are, yeah. Well, you're not going to those places as a journalist, right? You are going to go to a hospital as a patient, pretending to be a patient, right? And then you start building trust and relationship with the doctors, with the nurses, and talking with the people who've been in that hospital for days, for weeks. I've been sending my reporters as visitors to the prisoners, pretending to be visitors, and going and talking to the prisoners inside the prison. So everything about investigative journalism starts with building a relationship. The source should trust you that you're not going to reveal his or her identity, or you're not going to go, put them in danger in any way. That's what we do, this investigative journalism in Afghanistan.
You said earlier that it sometimes feels that the world has forgotten what's going on in Afghanistan, and that makes it more important for you and your colleagues to document these abuses that you're describing. How do you make the world listen? I mean, working alongside outlets like the New York Times helps, of course. But how do you make sure that Afghanistan stays in the headlines and that people know what's going on there?
Well, right now, different types of resistance happening against the Taliban. The biggest one and the largest one is led by women of Afghanistan. They are protesting peacefully, demanding their rights, whether coming to the streets, whether by writing, by talking, or singing, or coming out of the streets of Kabul or other cities of Afghanistan. Because this demand for rights is legitimate. No one should be able to limit or ignore the rights of humans because of their gender. This is called gender apartheid. That's what we're working on, to ask the support of the free world to recognize gender apartheid as a crime against humanity. And it should be defined in an international law system and judiciary system. For example, in the Statute of Rome.
For Sanjar, Western interventions, particularly over the last 40 years, mean that nations like the US, Canada, and the UK bear some responsibility for what's now going on in Afghanistan.
They came, they fought, they invested, and they spent many treasure lives. But they didn't finish the job. They didn't finish the job, and they again left Afghanistan. And now Afghanistan is in the same situation that was before. I'm not saying that we Afghans do not have any responsibilities. I mean, we do. We are trying our best as activists, as journalists, as ordinary Afghan citizens inside the country and in the diaspora communities to gain back our country from the Taliban and to build a society based on justice, based on rule of law, based on freedom. What we are asking right now is, okay, do not give us anything. Just do not cooperate with the Taliban. At least recognize our suffering. At least recognize that the things that's happening in Afghanistan is not civil, is not human. It's not for human beings in the 21st century to live like that, to stay or to live in a society where you have no freedom, no dignity. A Taliban fighter can come anytime, arrest you, torture you, intimidate you, kill you. You know, that's the situation that people in Afghanistan are facing.
Could I just ask, lastly, what does the future of Afghanistan look like? Do you think that the Taliban could be overthrown? Is it possible to do that without international cooperation? You know, you say you're not asking the international community like the US, Canada, the UK, and others to do anything as such, just not to cooperate with the Taliban. But without that cooperation, is it possible to overthrow the Taliban? And will the map look different in future?
Well, I am almost 45 years old right now. And in my life, I've witnessed at least 12 regimes in Afghanistan, 12 regime changes from 1981 to August 15, 2021. As far as I understand from your experience from the past, Taliban would not survive because the way that they are dealing with the society, the way that they are governing, the way that they are unable to provide basic services for Afghan citizens, they would not survive. And I personally believe that any type of dictatorship, totalitarian systems could not survive. There are thousands and thousands of examples in the human history. You cannot govern, you cannot rule a society with totalitarianism. So I believe that the Taliban would go away, would collapse. But the important thing is, after the Taliban, what are our options? What are our plans for after the Taliban era? As I said, we cannot live in a bubble. We cannot live safely, freely, securely in the Western capitals if we allow the Taliban to continue ruling Afghanistan. But as I said, I am also optimistic. I believe the Taliban would not continue. There will be resistance. There are resistance happening, peaceful resistance, armed resistance happening. And we've been able to at least to convince the world to not recognize the Taliban, because they are not the legitimate representative of the people of Afghanistan. They have came to power by force. They are controlling the government and the state by force. And they cannot win in a peaceful, legitimate, democratic, impartial election. They cannot win. They cannot win. They have no legitimacy. So that's why I'm optimistic.
You've been listening to Silenced. I'm Nicola Kelly. The producer was Kevin Caners. This is a podcast series for Article 19.